Hello and welcome to Mumble Technology Group. Today we will go through a short video on how to set up a cluster, a Window Server Failover Cluster. But before I continue, if you're here for the first time, I suggest to click on the link in the description and see how you can create a virtual machine. Go over the videos and learn how to create a virtual machine, and also see how to set up a virtual switch to configure a network connection between the virtual machines. And if you like our videos and our content, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the notification bell to get notified each time we upload a new content. So, our session for today, we will be talking about Windows Server Failover Cluster. And just a quick recap, this is the diagram we used in the previous video. We enabled and created our domain controller with the name mtg.com, and this is an IP address. And we also added two virtual machines to the domain controller. So we added two virtual machines called Node 1 and Node 2. And basically, after setting up the domain controller, we were able to ping each machine. So communication was established between these three VMs. So for our work for today, we are going to build a Windows Server Failover Cluster here. And the purpose for this is because in the subsequent videos, we are going to set up a high availability solution. And the primary or the prerequisite to set up a high availability solution, in this case, always on availability group, you will need to create a cluster. And a cluster is basically adding these two VMs within that Windows Server Failover Cluster in such a way that the VMs can be communicating together with addition of a quorum. So without any waste of time, let's go ahead and proceed to creating the cluster. And this video, I assume that you have gone on over our previous video and you were able to create your virtual machine. You were able to add your virtual machine to the domain controller after creating the domain controller, and that you were also able to enable or to establish a network connection between all the virtual machines. So in this case, we have three virtual machines here, one serving as the domain controller, and Node 1 and Node 2 are serving as standalone VMs. So this is my domain controller. As you can see here, my domain is mtg.com, and because I wanted to create an internal network switch, I had to turn off my firewalls so that my computers or my VMs can communicate internally. So we were able to create an internal switch. So to create a Windows Server Failover Cluster, we will need to install one of the key features that is required to set up a cluster. And for that, we are going to go to Node 1 and Node 2. So this is my Node 1 that is up and running. Let me also bring up Node. Okay, Node 1 is right here. I'm doing this because I want to be able to view all my drives on my physical computer or on my laptop in this virtual machine. So I have to enable the drives so that I can easily copy files across. So now, last time we created our virtual machines with the name administrator. Now, I don't want to use this name anymore because this is an elevated account administrator. What I have to do here, I will go in my domain controller and go in my Active Directory, and I will create a user account, and I will give that account some elevated privileges. And that is the account we're going to use to create our cluster. So I will go into Tools, and we can see Active Directory here because last time when we were creating this virtual machine, we enabled or we added this feature, Active Directory users and computers. So I'll click on this one, and it's going to bring up our Active Directory. In our Active Directory, you can create different OUs for different uses or organizational unit based on what you're doing. But for right now, I just want to create a user. And you can see here we have internal or default users that were created after we enable this Active Directory. So one of the ways to create a user, you can either right click here and go to new and the new user, or since we are already here into the windows of the users, you can just right click here and go to new and say create a new user. So this user, I'm going to give it a name, DB. I'll call this user a cluster admin. And I'm just going to make sure that I give it a fully qualified domain name. And by default, once this user is created, it's going to come with a fully qualified domain name using the domain and the backslash the cluster admin. That is going to be the fully qualified domain name. Okay. So click on next and provide the user's password. Make sure your password matches, and then you have different options here. You can say, okay, I'm creating this user not right now. By the time the user wants to log in, he can change the password. I don't need this. I just want to leave everything default as it is, and I'll create. Now our user is created right here, and it's called cluster admin. But as of right now, this user cannot log into any of the VMs we created initially because we haven't given it some of the permissions or some of the tools it needs to connect. So highlight and right click on the user, go to properties, and then this is where you can actually add the user into different groups. So for now, the user is just a member of domain admins, but I want to also make sure that the user is part of the remote, and it's going to ask you what the remote desktop users or remote management users. I need a remote desktop user. I need to add this one. And if you click on OK, it's already added here. I also want to make sure this user is part of, let me say, users, check name. Okay. What else? For right now, this should be fine. And if I need any other thing, I can always come back here and add the permission. Now apply and click on OK. Again, you can go back into the properties and view every other properties of the user. You can view the account right here. You can lock the user or you can unlock the account. And if this is a temporary account, you can set an expiration date, right, of the password. And once that password is expired, or you can set an expiration date of the account. So you can come here and provide a date of the expiration. And after that date, this account would not be valid anymore. Click on OK. So at this time, I will go ahead and try to log into my two VMs with the user account that I just created. I want to use other users. Let me just go with cluster admin and provide a password. Sometimes you need to take some time for the account to actually synchronize in the Active Directory before it can be used to log in. In most corporate environments, this usually takes somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes or maybe 15 minutes. So let's see if we can log in with this right now. And for now, it says username is not correct. Let's verify what is wrong. So I think we have an issue here, and I will need to sign in as administrator. I think I will need to sign in as administrator first. Okay, admin. So once I sign in as administrator, I will log out and then log in with a new account that we just created in the Active Directory. Right, so right here, you can see I'm signing as administrator. Let me just sign out first. And then I would now sign it with my admin user, cluster admin account. Since I was signing as administrator, there was no way I could sign in with that other account. So right now, It's going to bring up the window and we can sign in very quick. All right. So to sign in a VM, if it sign you out or if you went on sleep mode, you can just come on action, then Control Alt Delete. It will bring this window, provide a cluster admin name here and the password. So at this point, it's going to sign in without any problem. And right now, we are signing with the account we created in the Active Directory. So the first thing we want to do on board node is to install the Window Server Failover Cluster. Window Server Failover Cluster, we need to install that right now, the feature. So to do that, let's go to server management. And I think I showed you that last class. So once we're in server management here on our local server, this is node 2. You can go into tools, you can go into management and add roles and features. Or you can just go on dashboard here, you still have add roles and feature. So anyone you click on doesn't really matter. And to be able to set up your cluster, you need to install the failover cluster manager. It's a must. So click on next, leave everything default, and click on next. It should be down here, failover clustering. You need to install this, add features, next, and then we need to restart our PC once this installation is done. All right. Let me do the same thing on the node. Okay, it says I do not have adequate user right to make changes on this computer. So at this point, I will need to go in Active Directory and provide, I can sign out first and then sign in back as administrator and install this feature, right? I just created a user account, but that does not have all the right to perform this. So let me sign out really quick. And I will sign in as administrator. Okay, once I'm signed in as administrator, let's see if I can actually install the feature right now, which should work. And that is it. If you don't have enough permission to perform a certain task, that will not be possible. And you can see the feature is actually installing right now because I'm signing now like the administrator of this box. I didn't want to give enough permission to the cluster admin because it doesn't require that much permission. And this is based on Microsoft principle of least privileges. I will do the same here. I will sign out and I will sign in as admin. Okay. Once I'm in, I can add roles and features. Okay, still collecting some data. It needs some few seconds. I guess so. Right now, failover cluster manager. This is what I need. And install. So we're going to pause the video for now. Once it's done installing, I will go ahead and restart the VMs. And from there, we can set up our cluster. As you can see here, now we are connected as cluster admin, right? So one of the issues we had earlier was to add the cluster admin account to the domain administrator's account. That is kind of an account with elevated privileges that can perform certain activities. So let's go in our server manager and actually see if our failover cluster tool was added. And right here, we have the failover cluster manager. So click on this and it's going to open the cluster manager. So at this point, we are ready to create our cluster. And before we do that, let me take you back to our diagram right here. So we are creating a cluster between node 1 and node 2. And we have our IP range. And our IP range is 192.168.100. That is the IP range, right? So we will create now a cluster. And for you to be able to do that, you will also need to provide an IP address and a name to this cluster, because once the cluster is created, it will create a computer object in the Active Directory in the domain controller. So once the cluster is created between these two, the cluster needs to have a name and an IP address. And as such, at that moment, it will create a computer object here in the domain controller. So let's go ahead. As of right now, we don't have any cluster. And there are a couple of things to take into consideration while creating a cluster. First, you need to have a good naming convention for the cluster. Second, the IP address. Third, you have to run the cluster validation test. And we will see the reason why you need to do that. This is because if at any given point in time your cluster has a problem, which is a Microsoft product, you need to reach out to Microsoft. And the first question you will be asked is, do you have the cluster validation test? Because that is where they will start looking into to narrow down their troubleshooting steps. So right now we don't have no cluster. You have two ways you can create it. You can click on create cluster right here, or you can right click here and create the cluster, whichever one works for you. So these are just some informational things to take care of or to read. It's just telling you basically what the cluster is and what it's going to be used for. So I'm just going to assume that we know all these things and go on next. Now you need to add the names of the VMs that you want them to be part of this cluster. Since we have two VMs as of right now, we will add node 1 and node 2. And these VMs, since they are under the same network and in the same domain, in this case, you will be able to browse and find the VMs. So let's go with node 1. You can either click on browse, which is going to browse it in the Active Directory under computer objects, and it's going to find it, or you can just click on add, and it will come with a fully qualified domain name node1.mtg.com. Node 2, you can actually browse here and it will take you here and you still provide a name. So the object type here, you can see clearly that it's a computer that we're trying to look for. And where it's going to go look for, it's in the Active Directory in the domain controller. This is our domain mtg.com. So check names is going to see it and it will add it here. That is the first step. So these are the two nodes we're going to add in our cluster. Next is basically validating the test. So we have two options here. It's either you can run the test immediately, or you can create a cluster without running the test and do it maybe towards the end. But I want to run my test immediately. Click on next, and it's giving you basically every information that you need to know before you run the test. And click on next. So you can decide to choose certain tests that you actually want to run, or just leave Microsoft or the system by default run the recommended test, which is everything. I will just go with everything. Click on next, and this is the inventory and everything. Click on next, and this is the test running right now. So what is happening here, it is running a test on your hardware, on the software, on the components in the VM, and just trying to make sure that your VM meets the requirement to create a cluster. So at this point, everything definitely will run good. You might have a warning on maybe the network or the firewall, which is okay, it's negligible, but it's not going to stop you from creating your cluster. And at the end, we can now proceed to create our cluster. While this is running, let's give it some time. So at this point, you can see our cluster validation is done and everything succeeded, right? So everything is good so far. You can click here to view maybe and download the report, but I don't need it. I'm just going to click on finish. And there is one thing that is worth noting here. You run the cluster validation only once. In as much as you have 2 or more VMs, you run this only once. The next time you can add a VM to the cluster once it's created. So click on finish. And here, this is the next step, is to provide the access point for the cluster, right? You need a cluster name. So I'm just going to call this one DB cluster. The name is up to you. And you can see the network. We need to provide a network. The NetBIOS name is limited to 15 characters, right? So you can see that this is our network here, 192.168.100. So we need now to provide a network for this cluster. And I'll just say 20. I know I haven't used 20. Click on next. And at this point, it's creating our cluster. So if everything is good, the network setting is good, the validation has been passed, every other parameter is great, and everything is good, it should create your cluster without any problem. So it's going to take a few minutes, and at this time you see, it says you have successfully completed the create cluster wizard. Click on finish. Yeah. So this is done. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can go through the cluster properties, and here the roles, you don't have any role as of right now, but if we decided to use this cluster for a failover cluster instance, then the roles are definitely going to be the name of the SQL Server instances in the case of SQL Server. Now the nodes, if you click on the nodes, you will see we have node 1 and node 2, and both of them are running. Now you can see the current vote here is 1 and 0. This is because we have not yet set quorum. A quorum basically is that mechanism that participates in the vote to make sure that the cluster is always up and running. So if we create a quorum here, the vote will change from 1, 0 to 1, 1. So where you can see right here, the witness is none. We don't have any witness. So we can create a quorum witness, and the quorum witness can be a disk, share drive, file share, or it can even be in the cloud. So to create a witness, you can come here on the right where it says more action. If you don't create a quorum here, then that you will definitely have a problem, especially if the cluster is unhealthy and it has a situation like the split brain situation. That is where effectively the quorum will come in to participate with its own vote to make the cluster up and running. So you can come on more action and say configure cluster quorum, or you can right click on the cluster and go on where is the more action and configure cluster settings. So here, before we configure this, I will need to go and create a quorum, and the quorum cannot be either of these two nodes. So what I will do, I will go in my DC, which is my domain controller, and right here, I will create a folder, and I'll call this file share. So I'll call this file share witness, and before the two nodes can be able to write to this file share, because as of right now they don't have any right, they don't have that, they have not been mapped to this file share. The first thing you need to do is to right click, go to properties, and share this file. Right now you see it is not yet shared because we need to share the file to be able to obtain a network path that you can use when need be. So click on share, and right now you can click and precise the people to whom you want to share this file. But right now I'm just going to say everyone default and click share. Done. And once it's done, it's going to create this network path. So let's copy this network path because we're going to use it. Copy it. The next thing is security. For right now, under security, you can see these are the only people who have access to this file. If you don't give access to the tool node to talk or read or write data into this file, then it will not work. It will fail. Even in the case of availability group, if you needed a network path for your backup, your database backup and copy folder, then it will not work. Secondly, you also need to provide access to the cluster itself because the cluster itself is a computer object, remember? And let me show you that when you create a cluster, by default, it creates a computer object in the Active Directory with the name that you gave to the cluster. So if you go into Active Directory users and computers, and you go under computers, and definitely you will see DB cluster. It's a computer object that we created. And for that reason, these three objects here need to have access to the file share so that it can be able to either read or write data into that file share. So what are we going to do? Let's add everything that we need. We need a computer object, a service account, right? We also need a service account. Now we're going to use the cluster admin, the account we use to log into this computer. Click on OK. Right now, I need node 1, get names, space, node 2, get names. So I'm doing this together so I don't have to go and come back and forth. And then we have DB cluster, check the name, as well as cluster admin. Great. So what permission do we want to grant them? Right here, you have your permission and you can grant them granularly. You can either give them, allow them to read, write, and modify files. For my cluster admin, I'm going to grant everything. DB cluster, same thing. Node 1, I'll give something, and then node 2, same thing, and I'll apply the changes and say, okay. Good. At this point, let's get back to our quorum setting here. We are setting this quorum on node 2. Click on next. So use a default quorum or select a quorum witness. You can use a default quorum. I'm just going to select a quorum witness because I just created a file share quorum. Next. So you have a disk witness that you can use. You have a file share, which is actually what we need to use. Then you can also configure a cloud witness, maybe with a storage account in the cloud, or you can go with do not use quorum, do not use a witness. Next, this is where you need to provide the path of the file share that we created in the Active Directory or in the domain controller. So I can right click here and paste the path and say next, or better still, you can browse and go into your Active Directory to see it. So if I click on next, everything is done, everything is good, and finish. Now, let's go and check the vote right now. Initially, we had 1 and 0 vote. So let's check the vote right now. The rows, we don't have any row yet. Look at the note. You can see the vote change from 1-0 to 1-1. This is because we just created a quorum witness. There is also one thing that you need to know here. Which node is actually the owner of this cluster? And to identify that, you can just look here. The current host is node 2. Right, the current host of this cluster is node 2. Sometimes maybe you might want to do a Windows update or a Windows patch, and if the current host is node 2, what you have to do in that situation, you have to fail over the cluster resources to the next host or to the next virtual machine so that you can be able to patch this one. If not, if you just proceed to patching this one, it might cause some downtime, which is not acceptable. So how do you move the cluster resources from node 2 to node 1? Come back here on more action, and you can say move core cluster resources and it will ask you to select a node if you have multiple nodes, or you can go with the best possible node. Right now, we just have two nodes, node 1 and node 2. So you can click on select node, and it's just going to show you node 1 available because that's the only node we have. Click on it, click on OK, and you can now click on nodes. You can see that it should be filling over, right? I think that was pretty quick. We didn't notice it. Let's go back, and so you can see now here node 1 is the current host. So that's how we fill it. But another thing I want to point out here is, and this cluster, this is not a failover cluster instance. These cluster have separate storage. In a situation where you want to set up a failover cluster instance, maybe for your high availability solution, they will be using a storage network, right? They will be using a storage network. And for this one, you can see you don't have no disks here and you don't have no disk pools, right? That is because each node has its independent storage, as you can see right here. Every node is managing its own storage. But in a situation where you're setting up a failover cluster instance, then you will need to set up storage, right? You can set up a storage area network, a SAN, or any other storage. I hope you like and enjoy this video. In our next video, we will go ahead and set up a high availability solution. We will create an always on availability group. And for that, you will need to watch out the first videos on how to create a VM, how to set up the properties of the VM, how to create a virtual switch, how to create a domain controller, how to add VMs into the domain controller. And at the end, you need to set up this cluster because that is one of the things that is required to set up your always on availability group. Please, if you do not watch our previous video, you will find the link attached in the description part of this video. Thank you and continue to follow Mambel Technology Group.